In the year 1306, in the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey, a priest watches in horror as servants prepare for what courtiers whisper will be the most disturbing royal wedding England has ever witnessed. The great oak doors swing open, and his eyes widen in disbelief. The groom, King Richard II, stands tall at 29 years old, his golden hair catching the filtered light. Beside him walks what appears to be a child barely reaching his elbow. She cannot be more than 6 years old, this little princess in her elaborate gown, her tiny hand swallowed entirely by his gloved palm. This is Isabella of Valois, about to become the new Queen of England. You think you understand the darkness of history? You think you've seen the depths of how power operates? You know nothing. What you're about to discover will shatter every comfortable illusion you've held about civilization, about protection, about the systems that claim to serve humanity while feeding on its most vulnerable. This isn't just a story about medieval politics. This is the blueprint for how power has always worked, how it still works today. The same mechanisms that allowed a 6-year-old child to be bartered like livestock between kingdoms are operating right now, in forms you're only beginning to recognize. The marriage of Isabella wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a product of barbaric medieval times that we've somehow evolved beyond. It was the logical conclusion of a system that views human beings as resources to be allocated, traded, and consumed by those who understand the real game being played. While peasants worried about their next meal, kings and queens were playing chess with human lives across a board that spanned continents. Isabella was never a person in their eyes. She was a treaty, a living, breathing contract sealed with the blood of innocence. But here's what they don't want you to understand. The same power structures that orchestrated Isabella's fate are still operating today. The methods have evolved, become more sophisticated, more subtle, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. There is a class of people who view the rest of humanity as resources to be managed, manipulated, and sacrificed when convenient. They speak of greater good, of necessary evils, of sacrifices for the future, the same language used to justify trading a 6-year-old girl for political advantage. You want to know why this story matters, because understanding how they operated then reveals how they operate now. The royal houses of medieval Europe weren't just political entities, they were laboratories for human manipulation, testing grounds for the psychological techniques that would later be refined and deployed on entire populations. Isabella's story isn't history. It's a case study in how power justifies the destruction of innocence, how systems of control present themselves as protection while systematically harvesting what they claim to defend. The priest who blessed that unholy union understood what he was witnessing. He saw the mechanism in action, the way genuine human emotion, the protective instincts that should have shielded a child, were overridden by the cold calculus of political necessity. Richard II himself may have felt paternal toward Isabella, may have genuinely intended to protect her. But the system he served, the machine of power he was part of, had already predetermined her fate. His personal feelings were irrelevant. The machine demanded sacrifice, and Isabella was chosen. This is your first lesson in recognizing the patterns that rule your world. When you see authority figures making decisions that seem incomprehensible from a human perspective, remember Isabella. Remember that the system they serve doesn't value human life the way you do. It values control, stability, and the perpetuation of power structures that have been operating for centuries. The faces change, the technology evolves, but the fundamental logic remains the same. You're about to descend into a rabbit hole that will change how you see everything. Once you understand how Isabella's story connects to the broader patterns of manipulation and control, you'll start seeing these patterns everywhere. In education systems that sort children into categories of usefulness, in economic structures that treat human labor as a commodity, in media narratives that shape public opinion like a master sculptor shapes clay. The same hands that moved Isabella across the chessboard of medieval Europe are still moving pieces today. The only difference is that now the entire population is on the board. Isabella was born into a world where madness wasn't just a personal affliction, it was a tool of statecraft. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was known as Charles the Mad, but his madness wasn't random, it was systematic, calculated, and deeply connected to the pressures of ruling a kingdom built on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. When Charles believed he was made of glass, when he refused to bathe for months, when he forgot his own identity, these weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were the natural psychological response of a human being forced to operate within an inhuman system. You need to understand this. The kings and queens of medieval Europe weren't born different from you. They were human beings, placed within structures so corrupt, so fundamentally opposed to human nature, that maintaining sanity required either complete compartmentalization or complete breakdown. Charles chose breakdown. Others chose to become monsters. Isabella, at 6 years old, was being prepared for one of these paths. The French court where Isabella spent her early years was a laboratory of psychological control. Every interaction was calculated, every relationship was transactional, every moment of genuine human connection was evaluated for its political utility. Isabella watched her father oscillate between lucid leadership and complete psychological collapse, and she learned the most important lesson of her young life. Authentic human emotion was a liability that could be weaponized against you. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Charles's madness wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. A king who periodically lost his grip on reality was easier to control than one who maintained consistent independent thought. During his episodes, real power was exercised by advisors, court officials, and foreign influences who could shape policy without the inconvenience of royal oversight. Isabella's mother, Isabel of Bavaria, understood this dynamic perfectly. She used her husband's psychological instability as a tool for advancing her own political agenda. This is where you need to pay attention. The same psychological manipulation techniques that were used to control medieval royalty are being deployed against you right now. The constant stress, the information overload, the deliberate confusion between reality and manufactured narrative. These aren't accidents. They're tools designed to create the same kind of psychological instability that made Charles VI so easy to manipulate. When you feel overwhelmed, when you can't distinguish between genuine threats and manufactured crises, when you find yourself questioning your own perception, that's not weakness. That's the intended result of a system designed to break down your psychological defenses. Isabella learned to navigate this environment by developing what we would now recognize as advanced psychological survival skills. She learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to present different versions of herself to different audiences, to evaluate every interaction for hidden agendas. At 6 years old, she was already more psychologically sophisticated than most adults today. She had to be. Her survival depended on it. The court of Charles VI was a training ground for the kind of psychological manipulation that would later be refined and deployed on entire populations. The techniques developed there, the use of ceremony and ritual to create psychological submission, the deliberate creation of uncertainty and fear to maintain control, the systematic destruction of authentic human relationships and their replacement with transactional interactions, these became the foundation of modern psychological warfare. You want to know why you feel disconnected from authentic human experience? Why genuine relationships seem increasingly difficult to maintain? Why you find yourself constantly second-guessing your own perceptions and emotions? Look at Isabella's childhood. Look at how she was systematically conditioned to view human connection as a potential threat, to evaluate every interaction for its political implications, to suppress her natural emotional responses in favor of calculated strategic thinking. The same forces that shaped her psychology are shaping yours. The difference is that medieval courts were honest about their intentions. They didn't pretend to care about human welfare while systematically destroying it. Modern systems of control maintain the illusion of benevolence while employing the same fundamental techniques. They tell you they're protecting you while they're conditioning you. They promise freedom while they're installing invisible chains. Isabella's story reveals the blueprint they've been using for centuries. First, they separate you from authentic human connection. Then they replace natural relationships with artificial ones mediated by their institutions. Finally, they convince you that this artificial environment is normal, natural, and necessary for your protection. Isabella never had a choice in this process, but you do. The question is whether you'll recognize the pattern before it's too late. The negotiations that sealed Isabella's fate weren't conducted in throne rooms or royal chambers. They took place in windowless stone cells where men in robes calculated the precise value of a child's life measured against territorial gains, trade agreements, and military advantages. For months, ambassadors crossed the English Channel, carrying proposals and counter-proposals that treated Isabella not as a human being, but as a sophisticated piece of equipment in a larger machine designed to harvest human suffering for political gain. Every detail of Isabella's future existence was debated with the same cold precision that modern corporations use to design consumer products. Her education, her living conditions, her religious practices, even the circumstances under which she would eventually be used for breeding. All of this was negotiated, documented, and sealed with wax and ribbon. The treaty that determined her fate was hundreds of pages long, but not one line addressed her well-being as a human being. She was inventory being transferred between warehouses. You need to understand the level of systematic dehumanization this required. These weren't evil men making evil decisions. They were intelligent, educated, cultured individuals who had been conditioned by their system to view human beings as resources to be allocated efficiently. They attended religious services. They loved their own families. They probably felt genuine affection for Isabella personally. But when it came to the business of statecraft, personal feelings were irrelevant. The system demanded sacrifice, and they provided it. This is the same psychological mechanism that allows modern corporate executives to destroy entire communities while maintaining their self-image as good people. The same mechanism that allows political leaders to send millions to die in wars while sleeping peacefully at night. The same mechanism that allows educational administrators to design systems that crush children's natural curiosity while believing they're serving the greater good. The system creates psychological compartmentalization that allows decent people to participate in monstrous acts without recognizing their own complicity. The French negotiators who arranged Isabella's marriage weren't thinking about the psychological trauma they were inflicting on a 6-year-old child. They were thinking about tax revenues, military positioning, and the complex web of alliances that would determine France's position in the broader European power structure. Isabella's suffering was an externality, a cost that didn't appear on their balance sheets because it wasn't their responsibility to calculate. This is how all systems of exploitation operate. They create organizational structures that diffuse responsibility so thoroughly that no individual feels accountable for the human cost of their decisions. The negotiators weren't responsible for Isabella's well-being. That was the job of her future husband. Richard II wasn't responsible for the psychological impact of the marriage. That was a political necessity imposed by his advisors. The advisors weren't responsible for the long-term consequences. They were just serving the needs of the state. But here's what they understood that you don't. The systematic destruction of innocence isn't a byproduct of political systems. It's their primary function. Power structures maintain themselves by identifying individuals who pose a threat to their stability and neutralizing that threat through psychological conditioning. Isabella posed a threat not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented, the possibility that human beings could exist outside the system of control, that authentic human relationships could take precedence over political calculations. The marriage negotiations were actually a psychological operation designed to transform Isabella from a human being into a symbol. Once she became a symbol, she could be manipulated, traded, and sacrificed without triggering the moral objections that would arise if she were still recognized as a person. This is the same process that modern systems use to transform entire populations into demographic categories, market segments, and voting blocks. You want to know why you feel like your individual humanity is being systematically ignored by the institutions that claim to serve you? Because it is. The same techniques that were used to transform Isabella into a political asset are being used to transform you into an economic resource. The language has changed, the technology has evolved, but the fundamental process remains the same. First, they separate you from authentic human connection. Then they replace your individual identity with category membership. Finally, they manage you as part of a larger system designed to extract value from your existence. Isabella's story reveals the template they've been using for centuries. They don't destroy innocence directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they create systems that make the destruction of innocence appear necessary, inevitable, and even beneficial. They convince you that sacrificing authentic human experience is the price of civilization, that suppressing natural human instincts is the cost of progress, that accepting their management of your life is the requirement for protection. The men who negotiated Isabella's marriage weren't evil. They were products of a system that had trained them to view human manipulation as a technical skill, to approach the destruction of innocence as a problem-solving exercise, to treat psychological trauma as an acceptable cost of doing business. They were the medieval equivalent of modern technocrats who design algorithms to manipulate human behavior, who create educational systems that condition children for compliance, who develop media strategies that shape public opinion without regard for the psychological impact on individuals. The wedding ceremony that sealed Isabella's fate wasn't just a religious ritual, it was a carefully orchestrated psychological operation designed to transform a crime against humanity into a celebration of political progress. 2 ceremonies, actually. The first in Calais, intimate and controlled, where Isabella was displayed to a select audience of negotiators and high-ranking nobles who needed to witness the successful completion of their transaction. The second in Westminster Abbey, a public spectacle designed to convince the English people that they were witnessing the dawn of a new era of peace and prosperity. You need to understand the level of psychological manipulation required to make a population celebrate the systematic exploitation of a child. The English people weren't monsters. They were ordinary human beings who'd been subjected to sophisticated propaganda techniques that transformed their natural protective instincts into enthusiastic support for Isabella's destruction. The same techniques that are being used against you right now. The ceremony in Westminster Abbey was designed using principles of crowd psychology that wouldn't be formally documented until centuries later, but were clearly understood by the power structures of medieval Europe. The massive crowds, the elaborate pageantry, the carefully choreographed emotional responses, all of this was calculated to create a psychological state where individual moral judgment was suspended in favour of collective emotional experience. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter, decorated with English roses and French fleurs-de-lis, symbols that had been specifically chosen to create the illusion of voluntary union between equals. The crowd that lined the streets called out blessings in English, which she was only beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been taught. She was performing her role in a psychological operation designed to convince the English people that their natural horror at child exploitation should be replaced with patriotic celebration of political achievement. The 3-day coronation feast that followed was a masterpiece of manufactured consent. Jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicted the glorious future that this marriage would bring to both kingdoms. Noble after noble stood to toast the health of the child queen, each toast reinforcing the narrative that Isabella's sacrifice was not only necessary but beneficial. The entire event was designed to create the psychological impression that opposition to Isabella's exploitation was equivalent to opposition to peace, prosperity, and the welfare of the kingdom. This is the same psychological mechanism that modern media uses to convince you that your exploitation is actually your liberation. The same techniques that transform obviously destructive policies into popular mandates. The same process that makes you celebrate the systematic destruction of your own autonomy while believing you're participating in democratic progress. They don't force you to accept their narratives. They create psychological environments where accepting their narratives feels like your own idea. But here's what they don't want you to understand. The crowd that celebrated Isabella's marriage wasn't celebrating her well-being. They were celebrating their own psychological relief at having their moral concerns resolved by authority figures who claim to understand the bigger picture. The same relief you feel when experts tell you that policies that obviously hem in you are actually necessary for your protection. The same relief you feel when media narratives provide simple explanations for complex situations that would otherwise require you to think independently. The nobles who attended Isabella's coronation weren't celebrating a child's happiness. They were celebrating their own successful participation in a system that rewarded compliance with status and punished independent thought with marginalization. They understood that expressing concern for Isabella's well-being would mark them as politically unreliable, while enthusiastic support for her exploitation would mark them as loyal servants of the state. This is how all systems of control operate. They don't rely on force. They rely on the psychological conditioning that makes participation in your own exploitation feel like moral behavior. They create environments where questioning obvious injustices feels like betrayal of your community, where independent thought feels like selfishness, where authentic human concern feels like weakness. Isabella sat at the high table during her coronation feast, picking at her food with the careful manners her tutors had drilled into her, while hundreds of adults celebrated her destruction. She was 9 years old, surrounded by people who claimed to love her, while participating in her systematic dehumanization. She was learning the most important lesson of her life, that the people who claim to protect you are often the ones orchestrating your destruction. The same lesson you're learning right now. The institutions that claim to serve your interests are actually serving interests that view you as a resource to be managed. The authorities who claim to protect you are actually protecting systems that require your exploitation. The communities that claim to value you are actually valuing your compliance with narratives that justify your continued manipulation. Isabella's coronation reveals the blueprint they've been using for centuries. They don't destroy you directly, that would be too obvious. Instead, they create spectacular celebrations of your destruction, elaborate ceremonies that transform your exploitation into your elevation, sophisticated psychological operations that make you grateful for the privilege of being consumed by their system. Comment, "They know." If you're beginning to see the patterns that connect medieval power structures to modern systems of control, comment, "They know." If you understand that the same forces that orchestrated Isabella's fate are still operating today. Richard II's relationship with Isabella reveals one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques ever developed. The illusion of protection within a system designed for exploitation. Richard genuinely cared for Isabella. He visited her regularly, brought her gifts, took personal interest in her education and welfare. By all accounts, he felt genuine paternal affection for the child who had been placed in his care. But his personal feelings were irrelevant to the larger system he served, and his genuine affection actually made him more effective as an instrument of her destruction. This is the most dangerous form of manipulation, because it feels like love. Richard wasn't a monster. He was a human being who had been conditioned to believe that participating in Isabella's exploitation was the same as protecting her. He convinced himself that providing her with luxury and education was more important than questioning the system that had made her a prisoner. He focused on making her captivity comfortable rather than examining the legitimacy of her captivity itself. You need to understand this pattern because it's being used against you right now. The people who claim to love you while participating in your systematic exploitation aren't necessarily lying about their feelings. They may genuinely care about your well-being while simultaneously serving systems that require your destruction. Your teachers who claim to care about your education while conditioning you for compliance. Your employers who claim to value you while extracting maximum value from your labor. Your leaders who claim to protect you while implementing policies that systematically undermine your autonomy. Isabella's education under Richard's care was designed to transform her from a French princess into an English queen, but the deeper purpose was to replace her authentic identity with one that served the interests of her captors. She learned English customs, English history, English ways of thinking, all presented as gifts, as opportunities for growth and development. But each lesson was actually a step in the process of psychological colonization designed to make her complicit in her own exploitation. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own, but this apparent social integration was actually another layer of control. Her friendship with Margaret Holland and other noble children wasn't authentic peer relationship. It was a carefully managed social environment designed to normalize her situation and prevent her from developing the psychological independence that might lead to resistance. She was being taught to find her identity through relationships that were fundamentally transactional. This is the same process that modern educational systems use to condition children for lifelong compliance. They create artificial social environments where acceptance depends on conformity, where individual identity is discouraged in favor of group membership, where authentic human connection is replaced with institutional relationships mediated by authority figures who claim to understand what's best for everyone involved. Richard's gifts to Isabella, the exotic birds, the fine books, the musical instruments, weren't expressions of love. They were tools of psychological conditioning designed to create emotional dependency on the system that was exploiting her. Each gift reinforced the message that her well-being depended on his continued favor, that questioning the system would jeopardize the comfort and security he provided. She was being taught to equate love with control, protection with surveillance, care with management. The most insidious aspect of this manipulation was that it felt genuinely caring. Richard probably believed he was being kind to Isabella. The courtiers who managed her daily life probably believed they were serving her interests. The system had created a psychological environment where participating in her exploitation felt like loving behavior, where genuine concern for her well-being was channeled into activities that actually served the interests of her captors. This is how all systems of control operate. They don't rely on obvious coercion. They rely on the psychological conditioning that makes you grateful for your own exploitation. They create environments where the people who claim to love you are actually serving interests that require your destruction, where genuine human concern is channeled into activities that reinforce your captivity, where resistance feels like betrayal of people who claim to care about your well-being. Isabella's story reveals the most sophisticated form of psychological manipulation ever developed, the transformation of genuine human affection into a tool of control. Richard's love for Isabella wasn't fake, it was real. But it was love filtered through a system that had conditioned him to believe that her exploitation was the same as her protection, that his participation in her destruction was the same as his care for her well-being, the same conditioning that makes you grateful for institutions that claim to serve you while actually serving interests that require your exploitation, the same conditioning that makes you defend systems that systematically undermine your autonomy while believing you're protecting your own interests, the same conditioning that makes you feel guilty for questioning authorities who claim to love you while participating in your systematic manipulation. You want to know why authentic human relationships feel increasingly impossible to maintain? Because you've been conditioned to equate love with control, care with management, protection with surveillance. The same conditioning that made Isabella grateful for Richard's attention while he participated in her systematic exploitation is making you grateful for institutional relationships that systematically undermine your capacity for authentic human connection. The first signs of trouble came when Isabella noticed that conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared, that her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking, that even Richard himself seemed different, preoccupied, distant, staring out the windows as if expecting ships on the horizon. The carefully constructed reality that had made her captivity feel like protection was beginning to crack, and through those cracks she could see the machinery of power that had been operating beneath the surface all along. What Isabella was witnessing was the collapse of what we now recognize as a manufactured reality system. For 3 years, she had lived within a carefully constructed psychological environment designed to make her exploitation feel like elevation, her captivity feel like protection, her manipulation feel like education. But manufactured realities are inherently unstable because they require constant maintenance, and the political crisis that brought Henry Bolingbroke to power had disrupted the resources necessary to maintain Isabella's psychological conditioning. You need to understand this pattern because you're living through the same process right now. The comfortable narratives that have made your own exploitation feel like liberation are beginning to crack. The institutional relationships that have made your captivity feel like protection are becoming obviously transactional. The educational systems that have made your conditioning feel like enlightenment are revealing their true purpose. The psychological environment that has made your manipulation feel like care is becoming transparently artificial. Isabella's first real glimpse of her actual situation came when she woke one morning to find that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received only evasive answers. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing unfamiliar livery. The people who had claimed to serve her interests were abandoning her the moment those interests conflicted with their own survival. This is the moment when every manufactured reality system reveals its true nature. The people who claim to care about you demonstrate that their care was conditional on their own comfort and security. The institutions that claim to serve you reveal that they were actually serving interests that viewed you as expendable. The authorities who claim to protect you show that their protection was actually a form of management designed to prevent you from protecting yourself. Margaret Holland's visit to Isabella's chambers that evening was a masterclass in how psychological manipulation adapts to changing circumstances. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "Only the most essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." When Isabella asked where they were going, Margaret replied, "To the Tower. The King says it's for your safety." But Isabella understood the subtext. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of political upheaval the distinction became meaningless. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything in Isabella's previous experience. Instead of the ceremonial processions she was accustomed to, they travelled in a small, heavily guarded convoy. The curtains were drawn, but she could hear the sounds of the city around them, not the usual noise of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. The comfortable illusion that she was loved and protected by the English people was being replaced by the reality that she was a valuable asset, being moved to a more secure location. At the Tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. The windows were barred, guards stood at every entrance, and most of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since arriving in England, Isabella felt truly isolated. The psychological support system that had made her exploitation feel like elevation was being systematically dismantled. This is what happens when manufactured reality systems collapse. The comfortable illusions that made your exploitation feel like liberation are stripped away, revealing the actual power relationships that were operating beneath the surface. The people who claimed to care about you reveal that their care was conditional on your continued usefulness. The institutions that claimed to serve you show that they were actually serving interests that viewed you as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be valued. Richard's final visit to Isabella at the Tower was perhaps the most honest conversation they ever had. For the first time, he spoke to her not as a child to be sheltered, but as a political equal who needed to understand the realities of her situation. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many of the great nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of both England and the peace with France now hung in the balance. "What will happen to me, Isabella asked, displaying a composure that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a 9-year-old girl. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella could see that this uncertainty tormented him. This was the moment when the comfortable illusion that he was protecting her was replaced by the reality that he had been managing her on behalf of a system that was now beyond his control. The psychological conditioning that had made Isabella compliant for 3 years was being replaced by the raw clarity that comes when manufactured realities collapse. She was learning that the people who claimed to love her were actually serving interests that required her destruction, that the institutions that claimed to protect her were actually managing her as a resource, that the comfortable environment that had made her captivity feel like care was actually a sophisticated form of psychological control. This is the lesson you need to learn from Isabella's story. The comfortable narratives that make your exploitation feel like liberation are temporary. The institutional relationships that make your captivity feel like protection are conditional on your continued usefulness. The psychological conditioning that makes your manipulation feel like care is designed to prevent you from recognizing your actual situation until it's too late to change it. Henry IV's first meeting with Isabella revealed the ultimate truth about how power operates. She was no longer a person in their calculations, but a variable in an equation that weighed the cost of war against the benefits of peace. "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, referring to Richard with the directness that had become her hallmark. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favour of my claim to the throne." Isabella knew enough about politics to understand that abdicated meant was forced to give up the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. "What becomes of me?" she asked, and with that question, 9-year-old Isabella demonstrated more psychological sophistication than most adults achieve in a lifetime. She understood that her fate hung on Henry's assessment of how best to use the peace treaty with France, whether to maintain it or risk war for other political objectives. She had learned to think like the system that was exploiting her, to calculate her own value in terms of the larger machinery of power. This is the final lesson of Isabella's story, and it's the most important one. The system doesn't destroy you by making you weak. It destroys you by making you complicit in your own exploitation, by teaching you to think like it thinks, to value what it values, to calculate your own worth in terms of your usefulness to interests that fundamentally oppose your well-being. Isabella became psychologically indistinguishable from her captors, not because she was broken, but because she was brilliantly adapted to survival within a system designed to consume her. The political calculations that determined Isabella's fate were the same calculations that determine yours. How much resistance can be tolerated before force becomes necessary? How much exploitation can be maintained before the system becomes unstable? How much authentic human experience can be suppressed before people begin to remember what they've lost? Isabella was a test case for these calculations, and the techniques developed through her exploitation became the foundation of modern systems of control. You want to know why you feel psychologically disconnected from authentic human experience? Why genuine relationships seem impossible to maintain? Why you find yourself constantly calculating the strategic implications of your own emotions? Because you've been subjected to the same psychological conditioning that was used to transform Isabella from a human being into a resource. The same techniques that made her complicit in her own exploitation are making you complicit in yours. The men who designed Isabella's psychological conditioning understood something that most people never recognize. The most effective form of control isn't force, it's the systematic replacement of authentic human experience with artificial alternatives that serve the interests of power. They didn't destroy Isabella's capacity for love. They channeled it into relationships that served their purposes. They didn't destroy her intelligence. They directed it towards problems that reinforced their control. They didn't destroy her strength, and they harnessed it for their own objectives. This is how all systems of control operate. They don't eliminate human nature. They redirect it. They don't destroy your capacity for authentic experience. They replace it with artificial alternatives that feel genuine, but actually serve interests that require your exploitation. They don't break your spirit. They harness it for purposes that fundamentally oppose your well-being, while making you feel like you're serving your own interests. Isabella's story reveals the eternal pattern that connects medieval power structures to modern systems of control. The faces change, the technology evolves, the language adapts, but the fundamental logic remains the same. There is a class of people who understand that authentic human experience is incompatible with the systems that serve their interests, and they have developed sophisticated techniques for replacing that authentic experience with artificial alternatives that feel genuine but actually serve their purposes. The same techniques that were used to transform Isabella into a political asset are being used to transform you into an economic resource. The same psychological conditioning that made her grateful for her exploitation is making you grateful for yours. The same manufactured realities that made her captivity feel like protection are making your captivity feel like freedom. But here's what they don't want you to understand. The system that exploited Isabella is the same system that's exploiting you. The psychological techniques that were developed through her suffering are being deployed against you right now. The political calculations that determined her fate are determining yours. The machinery of power that consumed her is consuming you. Isabella's story isn't history, it's a blueprint. The same pattern that played out in medieval England is playing out in modern America. The same psychological conditioning that made her complicit in her own exploitation is making you complicit in yours. The same manufactured realities that made her captivity feel like protection are making your captivity feel like freedom. You have a choice that Isabella never had. You can recognize the pattern before it's too late. You can understand the psychological techniques being used against you before they become irreversible. You can choose authentic human experience over artificial alternatives that serve interests opposed to your well-being. You can refuse to be grateful for your own exploitation. The question is, will you make that choice? Or will you continue to participate in your own destruction while believing you're serving your own interests? The machinery of power is counting on your compliance. Isabella's story is your warning. The pattern is eternal, but your response doesn't have to be. Comment, "They know," one more time if you understand that the same forces that orchestrated Isabella's fate are still operating today. Comment, "They know," if you're ready to stop being grateful for your own exploitation.